Hi there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and this week I have been slowly losing my mind, actually. Good start, Joe. Good start. This was not supposed to be a video. I did not want this to be a video. I was just looking through some of my deck lists, and I happened to pause and ponder on the selection of mana rocks in one of those deck lists, and thought, maybe I'll take a few minutes to look over these mana rocks and see if there's anything I want to swap out. And those few minutes happened to turn into a week-long spiral that I have yet to escape from. So if you will allow me, I would like to use this video to also drag you into these chaotic inner workings of my mind, because I have been losing it over here and misery loves company and oh god, someone please help. But no, seriously, this whole existential crisis thing kind of happens almost every time that I try to make a cut to any of my commander decks. And I can't be the only person out there like this. So let's try and face this phenomenon head on, see if we can pick it apart and try to find a more productive way to move through it. Alright, let's set the stage. The hosts of my week-long existential crisis are these two, Eligeth and Essior, leaders of my mono-blue Scry commander deck. Eligeth turns all Scry into outright card draw, and Essior helps keep this expensive Sphinx a little safer. Eligeth is a powerful engine, turning random 1-mana cards into full-on ancestral recalls. Draw 3 cards for 1 mana, 6 cards for 4 mana, 9 cards for 5 mana. It's a silly deck, and it happens to turn some otherwise extremely bad cards into total powerhouse MVPs. And frankly, it draws so many cards that sometimes I just stop. I have to pause. I'm like, is this allowed? It's a dang good time, and though many players have used Eligeth to set up wins with Labman or Triskaidekaphile, those weren't the direction I wanted to go. I thought it would instead be a bit more fun to turn the hand size into a weapon itself, and in a word, punch opponents with your brain. Imperial Plate and Hand of Vecna, Psychosis Crawler, silly things that quite literally turn knowledge into power. So yeah, I was sifting through my deck because I was considering playing it for game night that week, and it had been a while since I'd played this one, so I took a closer look at it to see if it was shipshape. And as usual, I separate the deck into the main categories that I feel are the most important for this strategy's success, and during the course of things, I eventually paused on the mana acceleration section, and started wondering whether I was using the best rocks, or if things could use a little tuning up. Little did I know, this is where the spiral would begin. I wanted to weigh all of my best possible options, so let me briefly take you through the list of mana accelerants that I was considering. I'll start at the bottom and move up. First, of course, is Sol Ring, and I'm not playing a particularly juiced deck, so I don't have other fast mana beyond that one. Also, technically at the 1 mana spot is Wayfarer's Bauble, which can fetch for an island. Moving up to the 2 mana cards, there are also classics like Arcane Signet and Sky Diamond. In addition, a mono blue deck could use Sapphire Medallion too. Also considered here are Mind Stone to cash in for an extra card, Liquimetal Torque, which is just one of my favorite mana rocks period, and Cold Steel Heart, which is a lot like the Sky Diamond as well. The new Planar Atlas has absolutely caught my eye as a mana rock that also helps find another mana source if you need it. But paramount to the deck's success though is Thought Vessel, which gives an infinite hand size. And actually that moves me into the 3 mana cards, because Decanter of Endless Water gives the same benefit, but it can make blue mana instead of colorless. Related to the Mind Stone is the classic Commander Sphere to be cashed in for a card if necessary. And I can't forget Mana Geode, which scries a card, so Eligeth makes it draw a card outright. In fact, speaking of scry, Bronze Walrus is also in the consideration pile, because it's a mana dork that scries 2 when it hits the field. And the final 3 mana ramp card I was evaluating is Worn Power Stone. I also happen to have a few ramp cards that cost 4 mana or more, like the Scepter, Thran Dynamo, and Gilded Lotus. Eligeth is 6 mana to cast, after all, so some big ramp can really come in handy. And finally, of course, is Caged Sun, a great card for monocolored decks all over the format. Now, I just named like 18 cards, so I'm obviously not going to play all of those. I've got some cuts to make. So, let's work through the thought process. First things first, the highest mana cards warrant a big examination here. There are a lot of folks who are extremely skeptical of mana ramp that starts at turn 4, and they are right to be dubious about it. By the time you get to this spot on the mana curve, opponents are probably already pulling out bigger threats, so mana acceleration that has more alacrity is quite valuable. If you're playing, say, 10 ramp cards and 4 of them can't be cast until turn 4, well, nearly half your ramp package doesn't help you keep up with your speedier opponents. And in a casual blue deck especially, your opponents playing red or green are likelier to be speedier than you, and they will start beating you down with good threatening creatures if you take too long to get your stuff set up. So I'm actually only going to count these big mana ramp cards as extras, not as core mana acceleration cards. And honestly, lots of decks, lots of players don't like these big mana cards at all. So real quick, I want to explain why I'm keen to use them in this deck. For one thing, like I mentioned earlier, Elegith is 6 mana. That's a lot. Even a simple Thran Dynamo will make it significantly easier to cast Elegith a second time if he happens to get removed. But not only that, these mana rocks make it possible not only to cast Elegith, but to cast Elegith and a scry spell on that very same turn with that 1 or 2 extra mana, granting immediate value from Elegith's powerful scry engine ability. This really can be valuable. Essior gives the Sphinx guy some protection, but he's still got a big target on his back. Casting him for 6 mana only for him to get immediately removed, and I've gotten no value from that, and then I have to recast him again for 8 mana? That would be quite a blow. So getting an immediate return on a scry spell if I have extra mana from a big mana rock, yeah, that comes in real handy. But it's not just that, because this deck has some copy effects. Phyrexian Metamorph, for instance, can copy a big rock, which vastly increases the deck's mana output, and that actually is a huge deal for this specific strategy. After all, when things are going well, this deck can draw like 10 cards in a single turn, and that means I need actual mana to play any of them. So the bigger mana rocks are significant to help me not only deploy a huge draw spell, but also to hold up a protective counterspell or some other form of interaction to defend myself later on in that round. And I'm entirely serious, the copy effects really can get out of control. Echo Storm is amazing in a deck with 2 commanders. Like, have you ever gotten to use this to get 3 more copies of a Caged Sun? Cause I have, and it's absolutely glorious. Even getting 3 more Gilded Lotuses is pretty dang good, and it really sets the rest of the deck up for success. So even though the big mana rocks are not perfect for every strategy, I really do feel that they're great here, and that's why I want to make room for them. But I am again not counting them as core mana acceleration cards. I want to be sure to run an adequate number of lower costing rocks too to make sure the deck can keep up with everyone else. And thus, we now turn to examine those smaller rocks. And much like we did with the bigger ones, we don't just want the cards to be good on their own, we also want to evaluate the potential secondary and tertiary synergies that they could produce with other cards in the deck. For instance, Thought Vessel and Decanter are easily the 2 best mana rocks here, and low-key might be some of the most important cards in the entire deck. If I want that Imperial Plate to actually produce a lethal amount of damage, well, yeah, I'd better be able to hold on to all those cards I'm trying to draw. This deck aches if it has to discard to hand size. So these little mana rocks aren't just small value added, they're insurance policies, fully a cornerstone of the conditions of victory. Meanwhile, Cold Steel Heart is a snow card, and this is extremely relevant for this deck because of cards like Graven Lore or Merit Lage's Slumber. The more snow, the more scry, aka the more cards to draw, and it could even make that Merit Lage token come out a turn faster. So that's a small but important synergy worth taking note of. Wayfarer's Bauble and Planar Atlas also happen to have a lot of relevance to this same point. Fetching an additional snow island, or setting me up to find an extra snow island, could also produce extra synergy for the snow scrying cards. Not only that, but I'm also very fond of Scourge of Fleets, a one-sided removal effect that gets better the more islands you have. Ooh, and speaking of which, one of the first cards I put into this deck was the Foretell card, Behold the Multiverse, because of its scry output. But I wasn't content to just play one Foretell card. If I play something face down, I don't want my opponents to know what it is every single time. So I also put in Spectral Deluge, which has a similar effect to the Scourge of Fleets, counting the number of islands I control. Thus, that Wayfarer's Bauble increasing the island count is quite relevant indeed. In fact, it even helps with Caged Sun, too. That's a lot of cool incidental value. Okay, we continue. Liquimetal Torque is a great 2-mana rock, and it can also occasionally turn things into artifacts, and Well, I mentioned how much I like copying artifacts before, right? This little rock can make some really silly things happen. But it's not just that, it can also turn things into artifacts for the purposes of removal, which has really come in handy in a pinch. Then there's Mind Stone, and by extension, Commander Sphere. Sack to draw a card is a small amount of value that we're all familiar with, and that's why these cards see play in 417,000 decks and 370,000 decks respectively. And yeah, in a pinch, drawing an extra card is awesome to potentially dig back into a game, but here it's more than just that. It's one more damage with a Psychosis Crawler. It's potentially two more cards with a Teferi's Ageless Insight in play. In this deck, drawing just one more card could literally be the difference between winning and losing. And that's what makes the Scry rocks so good here too. These are great when developing, and they're great to draw later on when Elegith is already in play, to scry and therefore draw extra cards, which can have the same lethal rewards as those previous two rocks. But then, of course, we also have the rocks that are just good for their sheer efficiency, like Soul Ring and the Medallion. Both make it possible to chain multiple spells together in a single turn, which can be the difference between just playing Elegith or playing Elegith and casting an extra spell on the same turn. And I'll actually give mention to Worn Power Stone for the same reason, even though it's certainly clunkier. Plenty of folks have fallen out of favor with the Power Stone, but for this deck specifically, I find it to be pretty grand, and here's why. Essior can be played on turn 2, a simple start, then Worn Power Stone can come down on turn 3. So then, on turn 4, playing just one more land means we're now at 6 mana, which means Elegith can come down early with the protection from Essior. That 2 mana boost lines up perfectly with the exact tempo of this deck's commanders, which is kind of unique amongst all the other mana rock options. And finally, I haven't forgotten about the classics, Arcane Signet and Sky Diamond, which also just provide simple efficiency that cannot go ignored. If the rest of the players are dropping tons of ramp at turn 2, we do not want to be left in the dust. And actually, I've got to mention that the blue mana production is indeed quite relevant for this deck, because there are more than a few mana costs with specific blue pip requirements that I need to make sure I can hit reliably. And as much as I love Mind Stone and Torque and all them, too much colorless mana could genuinely get in the way sometimes. So blue mana production is definitely an important aspect to keep in mind. So yeah, those were the different mana rocks I was considering. Do you see the problem? I just went through all the options there, and it was like so easy to justify every single card in the considerations pile. Every single one of them had a really good reason to be there. Each one of them had different branching synergies that are all relevant to the deck's success. And obviously, I can't play all of them, because if I did play all of them, then that would eat into the space that I need for the rest of the deck's core categories. Like, if I'm playing 18 ramp spells, then that means that I have to play fewer removal spells or fewer scry spells in general. And, like, I need those, so yeah, I gotta make some cuts. Okay, so when this is the case, I don't just look at the upsides each card could provide, I also look at the downsides. For instance, Bronze Walrus may scry 2, which means it would draw 2 cards if I play it with Elegith on the field, but it's also a creature, which means it could get picked off pretty easily just from like an incidental random board wipe. But also, this deck doesn't contain a ton of creatures, and frankly, combat damage is really one of this deck's weaknesses. So sometimes I do want that extra blocker, but also, it's 3 mana. In fact, 3 mana ramp is a huge discussion point these days, and it's definitely worth noting that 3 mana ramp that produces a single mana is technically less efficient than any 2 mana ramp card. So really, all of the 3 mana ramp options deserve an extra critical eye. Then again, Essior is 2 mana, so maybe I can actually justify having more of my ramp effects at the 3 mana slot after all, because it's fairly common for Essior to be my turn 2 play. In fact, earlier when I was listing the different synergies for each mana rock, I did kinda notice that Arcane Signet and Sky Diamond were the only 2 mana rocks that didn't have overt synergies like the other rocks did. You know, Torque turning things into artifacts has definite ties to other cool cards in the deck, but the primary benefit of the Signet and the Sky Diamond are just their plain efficiency. So maybe those are the cuts? But wait, no, that's madness. I really do need blue mana production, and I should be more critical of the stuff that makes colorless mana instead of the stuff that makes blue mana, because I know from experience that every turn I always end up needing more blue mana than I thought I would. On that same note, actually, how good is Sapphire Medallion in this deck after all? I have plenty of single-pipped blue spells and artifact spells that this card just will not affect whatsoever. Or maybe the answer is actually to take out the higher cost stuff that I mentioned earlier, so then I can play all of the lower cost ramp effects. Is the early game efficiency the most important thing to make sure that the deck can get off the ground? Or is it more important to make sure that the deck can produce those bombastic late game swings with big mana producers after all? Now that I own one of those cool Scepter cards, maybe I don't need the Dynamo here anymore. Well, no, except I can't copy the Scepter like I can copy the Dynamo because the Scepter is legendary. Then again, I've had turns where the Dynamo's colorless mana production led to no follow-up play, whereas the Scepter's blue mana meant that I could play some random instant or some other such card as a follow-up. Then again, how relevant is copying just some random artifact after all? Like, yeah, I've made copies of them before, but were those actually just one-off lucky moments? Is trying to recreate that magic actually just a pipe dream? Well, I don't know, because this deck's whole strategy is to draw a butt-ton of cards, so I actually end up seeing a lot of the cards in this deck every time that I play it. So making those pipe dreams a reality does seem kind of doable whenever the deck gets off the ground, and when I'm in that state with like 20 cards in hand or whatever, I really appreciate the mana rocks that enter untapped and that can make mana right away, because they let me hold up defensive or protective spells. So maybe that's the key. I cut the rocks that enter in tapped because they're harder to deploy while keeping shields up later on in the game. But wait, how badly do I actually need to deploy more mana rocks in the late game if things are already going well in the late game? I mean, the commander is 6 mana after all. Don't I need to focus on smoothing out the early game to ensure that I can even deploy the commander in the first place? To that end, are these mana rocks that I've been pondering even the right ones that I should be evaluating? Maybe I should be considering other rocks instead. Like, there's another Scry Lantern that I haven't mentioned yet, or I have 2 commanders, so Relic of Legends could produce an extra mana boost, or maybe I should just look at other 2 mana rocks for more efficiency, or other ramp effects that would fetch more lands to up that Snow Island count. Or maybe I need to completely rethink this, like, how good would a High Tide be to double all of the islands for 1 bursty turn? And oh god, what happens if I manage to luck into getting an extra planar lens for this deck, and that doubles up my mana in another way? But, like, do I actually even want to play that one when it reduces the number of islands that I control, and I clearly care about the number of islands I control? And heck, this is just the mana rocks. Like, I could look at my removal spells with just as much scrutiny here. Like, am I playing the best ones here, or are there other removal effects that could save my bacon that would just be more efficient and better suited for the strategy? Like, this deck isn't using Cyclonic Rift because that's a lot of money, but let's say the deck just stumbles way too much, and I decide, yeah, no, this deck does really need some extra punch. Let's get the Rift in here after all. And therefore, I go to improve my board wipes, swapping out the cards that care about the number of islands I have, and then, well, does that affect how badly I need the other ramp spells that affect the number of islands I control? And if then I've taken out that one Foretell card, should I probably ditch the other one too, because then I wouldn't have that same fun unpredictability of people not knowing what my hidden card is? Or, heck, let's apply the same scrutiny to the suite of protective spells I've got. Like, I have some fun counterspells here that Scry, which Elegant then turns into draw, and that's way cool, but Scry counterspells are also more costly than some of the other more efficient counterspells, and that's a balance that's really hard to strike, because as goofy as I want this deck to be, Elegith drawing a dozen cards tends to draw a lot of attention, so I need to get some actual genuine efficient counterspells in here that don't cost a lot of mana to play to defend against all of that attention. Should I just capitulate completely and commit whole hog going for the fiercest of the fierce counterspells, or am I just being a complete dunce if I fail to play Scry counterspells that are genuinely very good with Elegith's ability, like Bane's Contingency, which would not only counter a removal spell but could also draw 3 cards? Is it rare that these stars ever align, or am I leaving value on the table? I don't know. And this is why I've been in a spiral, because I don't know. Because I don't know the answer to those questions. I have a dumb human flesh brain that cannot easily math out the answers to all of those different questions. Like, here I am spending 6,000 words just trying to reason my way through which mana rock I want to play in this deck. And not only am I still no closer to figuring out that answer, I'm also now starting to question the cards that I'm using in all of the other categories of my deck. And by the way, this did not get any easier when I decided that it might make for a good video, because now I also know that I will definitely feel like a complete dork if there are folks reminding me of any, for example, potential synergies that I missed in this, or if I end up cutting a card that has other upsides that I didn't yet mention, or if I end up heaping praise onto a card that a lot of folks are like, yeah, but it's got these other downsides that you didn't seem to be aware of. To an extent, this is a fear that I have with like every single upping the average video, because an integral part of those videos is that in order to add in new cards, you have to justify cutting out something else to make room. And the honest reality of the situation is that these days, when we want to add something new to our decks, we're not just cutting out good cards from them, we're cutting out great cards from them. Realistically, cutting one card isn't just cutting one card anymore. Every single card has tendrils, ripples, domino effects of amazing, awesome value and terrific synergies that branch throughout the entire rest of the deck list. With every card, we're using all parts of the buffalo. It's not just a ramp card anymore. It's a ramp card that helps with a snow strategy. It's a ramp card that helps with an artifact synergy, or one that could help us with certain types of removal. A ramp card that we could copy, one that helps us draw extra cards, and so on. And that's why everything feels impossible to cut, because every card has a compounding effect upon one another. And it's just really dang hard to figure out which of these cards has 3 times the normal amount of value, and which of these cards has 3.1 times the normal amount of value. I don't know, maybe some people can figure that out, but I've got the dumb human flesh brain, remember? And what really gets me is that in like 3 months, I'm probably going to end up doing this exact same dance like all over again, because some new amazing set is going to come out with some new amazing cards, and yeah, I'm going to consider, do I want to play any of those too? I mean, that's the reason I get stuck in this type of situation in the first place, right? Like new cards come out and I'm like, oh, would this deck like any of those? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Let's consider it. And then instead of a solution, I end up with decision paralysis. Now, obviously, I don't need new cards, but like new cards is not what this is about. Like this conundrum is not purely the result of constantly chasing after the latest and best stuff, you know? I could ignore the next several Magic sets for like a full year, but this will still come up. If I happen to come across a card that I really like, say it's some new piece that I happen to see an opponent play in game, or even some janky old card from like a decade ago. If I'm like, hey, that's kind of fun, maybe I'll get one for myself. If I do decide that I want that card, well, to add it, I'm gonna have to make a cut. And that means inevitably I'm gonna have to go through this whole rigmarole all over again. Ignoring new sets wouldn't be a solution. It would just be a delaying tactic. I want to linger on this point to make sure that I drive it home. This situation doesn't just come up when you are chasing the most efficient version of every effect. Even if you're trying to make room for silly jank, to make room for that silly jank, you will have to cut other cards that are also capable of silly jank. Heck, I think this actually would all be easier if my only metric was sheer power and efficiency. Like, if I was just chasing power creep, at least then I wouldn't have this additional tension between the cards that are silly and fun that I like and the cards that are just good and help make the deck run in the first place. Any time you have to make a cut for any reason, you are weighing potential against potential. And these days, every single card in our decks is overflowing with potential. And frankly, throughout all of this, I have found myself increasingly super tempted to just be like, screw it. Table flip and all. Just like, I don't want to do delicate, intricate mathematics to try and squeeze every last drop of value out of every last card in the deck. Like, just shatter all of that nonsense by just slapping in whatever and going and playing the dang game. Like, who cares, Joe? Stop your whinging. Stop all this silly theorizing. Just, do you want to play the game, or do you just want to sit here talking about it? It really makes you stop and appreciate the restrictions and variations that more and more players are coming up with these days. Like, I don't think pre-DH is for me. That's a version of Commander where you're only playing cards from before the release of Commander-specific products, but I totally see the appeal, because that restriction prevents you from having to deal with a huge swath of cards out there, and not having to worry about that prevents cognitive overload, and frankly feels like one heck of a weight off your shoulders. Or I think of players who like to use self-imposed restrictions, like playing a deck that has no enchantments whatsoever to make certain cards one-sided, or having a budget limit, or even just using a companion. Any one of those limitations can make the whole process a lot easier and make upgrades much more straightforward. And the reason I thought any of this might be prudent to put into a video isn't because I myself am trying to figure out which particular cards I want to use. Like, those don't matter. I am not the point. In fact, confession time, a piece of me actually really enjoys that whole chaotic spiral. I know, plot twist. But like mapping out all of those cool synergies throughout your entire deck list is, for me at least, one of the cooler aspects of the Commander format. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's also sometimes one of the most aggravating parts of the Commander format, but it's really fun too. But anyway, no, the salient point that I think is worth making here is that when having these different deck building discussions with each other and mentioning these different synergies and intricacies, upsides and downsides, it is entirely possible for everyone in that conversation to all disagree with each other and still all be correct. Take the Dynamo and Scepter example that I used earlier. The Scepter produces blue mana, which is way valuable in a deck with this many blue pips. However, by contrast, the Dynamo isn't legendary, and therefore it can be copied with some of my very favorite cards in the deck for a huge boost in mana. If two players are arguing about which one of these cards to play, they would both be correct about the value, downsides, and relevance of each card. Neither person would be wrong, but I feel like it's so common to look through online conversations or forums or deck advice threads and find players talking past each other like this. I swear, in the comments of every single video, I see two people with the exact opposite take of each other, one person asserting that a card is total garbage and the other asserting that the card is a total powerhouse. And yeah, some examples are comical, but some examples really do get very difficult indeed. And if you're genuinely trying to figure this stuff out, those opposite talking past each other takes are not going to help you out. Take the Bane's Contingency example that I happened to mention earlier. It's a 3-mana counterspell, and in the Commander format, most of the counterspells that we end up using tend to be around either 1 or 2 mana. But in this deck, Bane's Contingency could draw 3 cards with that bonus scry effect. So, is this a clumsy, clunky counterspell? Or is it a secret bomb? I still just do not know. And I think it's important for me to convey to you that I do not know. I just as easily could have framed it either way in this video. Like, I could have pointed out that Elegith is a high-profile target who's likely to come under fire from lots of pinpoint removal spells, increasing the likelihood that this card will find a worthy spell to counter and draw 3 cards when it's played. And that even if it is used to counter a different type of spell, having to use 3 mana to stop someone from winning the game is still at least a decently common rate. Or, by contrast, I could have pointed out that Essior makes Elegith a little less likely to fall prey to pinpoint removal, and thus our attention ought to go towards more counterspells that help stop people from playing, for instance, board wipes. Plus, having a 6-mana commander means that a lower cost counterspell is much easier to hold up than a 3-cost counterspell, so we'll rarely ever have the opportunity to use this thing at the point when Elegith is actually at his most vulnerable. Neither one of those takes is wrong, just like none of the mana rocks I've been stuck pondering about is outright bad to use either. Any one of them could be the best, and any one of them could also end up being the worst. More and more, the ultimate barometer that I use when I'm trying to figure out which card I'm going to put into my deck is just which cards make me smile the most. And that can simultaneously be really good advice that cuts right to the core of the issue and encourages a healthy play dynamic, while also being kind of useless advice for a person who's genuinely just trying to find the best way to tune up their awesome fun Ferrari of a deck. Magic players are very good at finding interesting synergies and cool corner cases, and that makes us extremely susceptible to convincing ourselves that we have found the right option. And that puts up our blinders, and it makes us forget that there could actually be many right options out there. And we end up, as a result of that, talking at each other rather than talking with each other. I'm still not entirely confident about which blithering mana rock I'm going to end up using my dang deck, but I extend grace to myself when I recognize that I am struggling with these different complicated choices, and I hope that that can remind me to extend that same grace to other players when they have also put up their blinders, or when they are also struggling with these different complicated choices too. And why, yes, this lesson is very applicable to other aspects of our lives. Good on you for noticing. Because it's hard. Like, the nitty-gritty, minute details can be really complicated. I spent a full week just staring into this mana rock abyss and the abyss staring back at me. And all I learned was that abysses are stupid. But I also hope I don't end up using this as a reason to not make intelligent choices, you know? As tempting as it would be to just say, screw it, and just play whatever, I don't think that would be very fulfilling for me. Knowing that stuff's heckin' complicated doesn't feel to me like a reason to give up on the search. It feels to me like a reason to keep experimenting, keep tinkering, keep exploring, keep learning. Even if I don't end up making a single change to the deck list, that's still a decision, right? Even if the choices that I make don't end up being the best ones, I still find a lot of value in the process of having made a choice. And I hope you do too. So to wrap things up, I guess I kind of have to say which cuts I ended up making, right? So here goes. I like the Walrus, it could be a blocker, and the Scry is great, but since it could die to random board wipes, I decided against it. I also decided against the Medallion, because it turns out nearly half the deck is comprised of artifacts or single-pipped spells. Medallion would only affect 32 of the 64 non-land cards here, so it's only ramped for 50% of the spells in the deck. I'm also dropping the Commander Sphere, which I've dropped from plenty of former decks many times before. 3-mana rocks are just getting better and better competition these days. And since I already have the Scry Mana Geode, I don't know, I just think that one happens to fill this slot a little bit better. And finally, I don't actually own a Planar Atlas yet because it's hard to come by, but I'm very, very intrigued by it. So once I finally do get a hold of one, whenever that is, I'll try swapping out the Bauble. Bauble increases the Snow Island count and it can be paid for in installments, but it's still ultimately 3 mana for a tapped mana resource. I want to give the Atlas a shot because it's ramp and it could optionally help find a future land, which could help me wriggle out of those occasional situations where I have to use up an early Scry spell to make sure I'm hitting my land drops. All that could help me save the extra Scry spell for when Elegith is finally in play to draw more cards, and that sounds pretty cool. So after however long, here's the new Mana Rock loadout, and you can always find the link to our deck lists in the description of our videos if you want to see any other changes that the decks might undergo in the future. I'm curious what you think about these cuts and whether you would have made a different decision, but more than that, I'm really interested to hear how you navigate these tricky situations where everything's got a really good justification, but you still gotta make a tough choice. Let me know in the comments below, and as always, remember to EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.